glad you could make it. You either all got shoveled out or you went across the street. I don't know. Which one comes up.
13 hours.
Terry Dalton is our speaker tonight. She was the founding chairman before Wisconsin Green Fire. Talk about that organization tonight. Her background includes over 30 years of environmental education, policy, and research, from studying moons in northern Wisconsin lakes to leading art science collaborations at Trout Lake Linology Station. She has held positions with the National Park Service, Sigurd Olson Environmental Institute, North Lakeland Discovery Center, U.S. Geological Survey, Wisconsin DNR, and UW-Madison, to name a few. It's been busy. She currently lives in Bayfield and made it all the way down here with no trouble, I assume. I hope.
Staying overnight, right?
I am, yeah.
Wisconsin Green Fire is for natural resource public policy in Wisconsin. Changes in longstanding federal laws like the Endangered Species Act, the Clean Water Act, and the National Environmental Policy Act will impact us all in Wisconsin. Terry will share examples of important science that need to inform decision making. She will also propose ways that we can try to bridge the gap between people with different political views that protect economics and cultural values. Welcome, Terry.
Okay, I'm going to stand behind here and I hope everyone on the Zoom can hear well enough. Does that sound loud enough to everybody? All right. Well, thank you for inviting me down, and I'm happy to say that you guys have more snow than we do. Well, we actually have maybe more on the ground, but the last storm, we were sort of gleefully watching you guys for a change. So we only got maybe 1.5 feet of snow, but it did blow pretty hard. So it was quite a weekend, I suppose. I wanted to just start by asking how many people here are supporters or members of Green Fire? Quite a few. Okay. And I know Melissa Johnson, who's our executive director, who lives right here in Stevens Point, spoke to you a couple of years ago, I think on the topic of PFAS. Thank goodness she talked about that because I know nothing about it. And although Bob made it sound like I'm going to talk about some sort of technical things tonight, really, I'm much more of a generalist. I come from an environmental education background, so I won't get too far into the weeds. But we do have one of our work group co-chairs here, Nancy Turek. So I'm going to, I'll lean on her if we get any really tough climate change, renewable energy questions. So anyway, I'm going to run through this kind of casually. So if you have a question, raise your hand or ask, and I'm hopeful that our technology is going to work here. So the last couple of talks I gave were actually Science on Tap talks where I was not allowed to have a PowerPoint. So I had to go back to my old historical years of being a park ranger, you know, where you didn't have any props or anything. And I started with this little thing that I asked the audience about, because we were talking about like the whole idea of how we view science in our world today. So I thought it was kind of fun to just do a little poll at the beginning. How many people here would consider themselves a scientist? Okay, I should have known that that would be a large quantity here in Stevens Point and at the local Audubon. You can imagine in a normal group of average people, you'd get a few hands, but not very many. How many people here would consider they do citizen science as well? Okay. And then here's the easy one. How many people checked the weather report this morning? Or noticed if the robins were back? Absolutely. So one of the points I'd like to start out with is to just say that in some ways we are all scientists. And our group, Wisconsin Green Fire, started, and we kind of got this reputation for being these deep in the weeds science types. But one of the things that I think is really hopeful is that because we all live here on a shared planet, We're surrounded by science and we encounter it on a daily basis. So in some ways, we all have the capacity, no matter how deeply we want to get into science, we all have that in our DNA because we live in a world where observation, inquiry, and experimentation that's how we survive. So I think it's kind of fun to think about that, especially when we're talking to people who don't think of themselves as scientists. And of course, here in Wisconsin, and you folks are the Aldo Leopold chapter of Audubon, is that true? We have this incredibly rich conservation heritage. So we have a lot of laurels to rest on, all the way from our Native American neighbors who started working on relationships with nature, to Muir, Gaylord Nelson, et cetera. So we have a great wealth of background here in our state and a connection. This is the mission of Wisconsin's Green Fire. We advance science-informed analysis and policy solutions that address Wisconsin's greatest conservation challenges. How many here have worked on a mission statement before? You know how much fun that is, but we actually, I think this one works pretty well. It does say what we do. We work on these really important issues that we all care about here in the state. This is a little word cloud that was developed by Dr. Stan Temple early in our existence. Probably if we did one today, it would be a little bit different, but this kind of showed the expertise of some of our members. We actually run most of our policy analysis and writing using volunteers because we started as a volunteer organization. So, and I'll tell you a little bit about that founding in a minute. The ways that we work, you could think of it as kind of policy wonk types, and we do a little bit of that. We testify at the state capitol. We meet with leaders, whether it's the local mayor's office or the state capitol. But we also do field trips. We do a lot of publications. When we started 9 years ago, we actually printed a lot of those. Now, more of them are online. And in fact, I was going to have materials here for you today, but Melissa got caught up in some things today with snow and other issues. So she was bringing me a batch of our new brochures. So you'll have to go to the website to look for materials, or give your neighbor Melissa a call, say, where were those, right? But we do a lot of publications, and we also have a really strong interest in working with next generation conservationists. It's a really, most of our members who are active volunteers are late career or retired, which is very typical of volunteerism in, I would say, in our country, in Wisconsin. But we have a lot to share across those boundaries with young people, and they have skills that we need and we have skills that they need. So it's a really nice way to tie together with people that are looking for experience, but also can help us with things like communication and also incorporating new ideas. We have a whole bunch of work groups. I'm not going to read all of these to you, but everything from wildlife to climate to environmental rules, fisheries. They're at varying levels of activity, depending on what issues have risen to the front of importance at that particular time. We also have a science council, and that's a group of sort of overarching people who give us big picture thinking about where we should be heading as an organization. So just a quick story about how we got founded. And I put this up here. I thought it was appropriate to 3 totally disassociated things that happened to get our organization started. Started in 2017, and if you can think back to then, that was when Scott Walker was our governor. There were a lot of issues going on in Wisconsin with science and science policy. The DNR's website had been scrapped of any information about climate change. People couldn't go out and give public presentations from state agencies. There's a lot of concern. People were losing their jobs. Scientists were being fired. And one morning, my husband and I were sitting around grumbling as we drank our coffee, and I heard the news on public radio that Scott Pruitt had just been named to be the new head of the EPA in DC. Now, when we were struggling here with acceptance of science in Wisconsin, we always thought, oh, the feds have got our back. And then here I heard a climate denier was going to be in charge of the EPA. And I'm going to make an assumption here that probably most of the people in the room are not, that they do accept that climate change is happening. If not, we can talk afterwards. So anyway, we're drinking coffee and complaining. And then as I want to do sometimes, I headed off and went and I swam laps. And sometimes when I'm swimming, I ponder things, and I was swimming along and so frustrated. I said, well, we just have to do something. We just have to call all our friends, stop grumbling, and just get together and do something. So when I got home, that's what we did. We sent out an email to friends, and they sent the email to friends. And then in a terrific February blizzard, howling deep snow, 50 people showed up at Kemp Station in Lake Tomahawk in the blizzard to form Wisconsin's Green Fire. We had some really great people. George Meyer was there. Stan Temple, who maybe many of you know, he's a Leopold Scholar. Lots of leaders from the DNR and other agencies. Susan Hedman, the previous EPA Region 5 director. So there are a lot of people. And we formed a group, and now just 9 years later, we have been up and running, and we have 5 staff, part-time, not all full-time, but we have staff. So that was way longer than you needed to know. But so we are mostly driven by volunteers, but we have staff that help us. So when we started, we made a list of issues that we thought were important. These are some of them, everything from the role of science in policy, the public trust doctrine, which determines how that our waters in the state belong to everyone, all the way to climate change. But I thought for tonight, it would be useful to get just a few ideas from you guys on what you think the most important conservation or environmental issues are right now. What's that?
Clean water.
Clean water, okay, that's a good one. What else?
Climate change.
Climate,
Loss of habitat.
loss of habitat, yep.
Human capos.
CAFOs, those were on the other list too, yep.
Rapidly decreasing sex, birds, etc.
Say that again.
The rapidly decreasing number of insects and birds.
Right, and in some broader sense, even just loss of biodiversity, yeah, yep. So we have some huge challenges ahead. And beginning in 2025, the world changed a little bit here in the US, and we started hearing from a lot of our volunteers and supporters. And up until that point, we had been pretty much Wisconsin focused. And when 2025 happened and the administration shifted in Washington, we saw a lot of the same science policies being put in place in Washington that had been perhaps test run here in Wisconsin. And we were getting calls and emails talking about, we have to do something about this. And, you know, we were already doing what we thought was a full-time job, and everybody was a little, you know, deer in the headlights. And it kind of felt like a mission impossible. How can we possibly tackle all these issues? But our science council got together and they decided we had to do something. But because we have such limited staffing capacity, we decided that it had to be driven by our volunteer experts. And so we've started working on this. And as part of this, I'm going to digress here a little bit into a quick sort of discussion about the underpinnings of what it means when we take on some of these federal issues and what's going on in the world right now. And one of the things that I found was a quote out of a paper in the kind of prestigious journal Science from August of 2025 that was talking about the importance of science and democracy. And I think all of us know that things are different now than they were a few years ago. Under the current administration, not only is science being distrusted, but the way that we approach democracy has shifted. And in this paper, Chenoweth and Goldman said, the United States democratic leadership commitment to freedom of expression and investment in the pursuit of knowledge have long enabled its preeminence in science and technology. Yet today we are witnessing what happens to a nation's science and technology expertise when democratic principles and the rule of law are ignored. The U.S. scientific community is well suited to play a leading role in pushing back, drawing inspiration from historical cases that have been effective. So we've started thinking about not only science and conservation, but what does this mean? The whole idea of our democracy. What is the role of science in democracy? And I looked back at some of our founding principles from those first meetings, and we basically had little d democracy built into our organization, that science is part of democracy, that everyone has a right to clean air, water, and land, and that transparent, fair, future-thinking government is what we really want. We want fairness and equity. And I've kind of paraphrased a much lengthier list into that, but I mean, it was really saying that it's not just conservation, it's about the way we view life. And, you know, I think one thing that we did that I thought was pretty brave is about a month ago, Greenfire came out with a statement in response to the Minneapolis protest movement. And it was basically saying that, hey, we don't like what's going on here, and we're going to stick up for it. And one of the things, we wrote a statement, it's on our website. We said, our conservation mission rests on the rule of law and the rights of people to engage in democratic processes that shape laws, a social contract of shared trust and respect. And this has pushed us, what you might say is a little more political. We're a 501c3, we're not supposed to be partisan, but we are seeing the system as being vulnerable. So we're pushing a little bit further, because if we don't have a social system that will listen to facts and allow people from all areas to come together, we're not going to be able to do good science and conservation policy. I was talking to a good friend of mine who's a professor emeritus up at Michigan Tech in social sciences. And she posed these three questions to me. Do facts and science even matter to people in the US anymore? And, you know, I don't think it's true, but it's a question that can be debated. Do people even listen to science? And what science? And then what voices get to be heard in conservation decision-making? Does our government decision-making use science? And who gets a seat at the table? Who's got the position of power? And I think all of these things need to be baked into our system and implicit if we're going to have good conservation policy. I'm going to share one more thing, and then I'm going to go back to environmental issues. I'm sticking my neck out here a little bit because this is a guilty as charged AI summary. And I didn't do this, but I stole it from someone. So I'm hesitantly putting this up here, but it made a point to me. And it was this comparison of science in different political systems, and it compared democracy and autocracy. And this is probably full of holes because in no way has our democracy ever been perfect in incorporating science and viewing it correctly. Look at where we started from with, so we're not perfect, but I think it's an interesting instruction in that in some ways we pretend at least, or we purport that in a democracy, the goal of science is discovery and public welfare, that data access should generally be available, that error correction should be encouraged through peer review, and the scientist's role should be an independent expert. Versus in a more autocratic system, we assume that the goal is strengthening the state or regime. The data is restricted or classified. The error correction can be seen as dissent. It can be risky. And a scientist's role, tool of the state. And I actually, on the way down today, talked to a retired history professor from Lawrence who was an expert on Russia. And I was pondering whether I should leave this chart in here. So I called him up and I said, Mike, what do you think about this, comparison of science in an autocracy or a democracy? And he gave me he said, well, there's a classic example that when Stalin was in Russia, he really wanted to get the Green Revolution going. And he didn't like that the agricultural community, they said, well, it's genetic and you have to work on it. It takes a long time. And there was another scientist who said, oh, no, I can do it much faster by just, treating the plants right or cutting them off in certain ways, or, that by nurturing them in a certain way that they could change the characteristics for the long term. And so he invested all of the energy, and that scientist, all the geneticists got the boot, and it put them way back because they were following the wrong science. And I said, well, do you think I can extrapolate that? He was like, well, I have to think about that. But it's an interesting thing to think about. And how is that happening today? For example, not even just in conservation, but in the health world, depending on where you sit on that fence. So here's what Green Fires decided to do. We can't do everything because there's so much going on at the federal level, and we're still running our Wisconsin ship at the same time. But we've kind of decided to focus on 3 areas: public lands and cuts to public lands and research, so funding cuts, changes in regulations, and then process questions. Sometimes it's like this in the weeds method of how something happens that makes it difficult to get the right information in. And we are still viewing this through a Wisconsin lens. So we did put that sidebar on. We're not going to deal with something that's in Hawaii primarily. We're going to view this through a Wisconsin lens. So here's one thing that we started off with right away that I think is a good example. There were proposed changes to the Endangered Species Act. Maybe many of you know about these, and those changes have been approved by the Trump administration. And we wrote a lot of heartfelt comments along with many others about this, but there were small changes in the act, but had big impacts. So they removed the idea of critical habitat for endangerment, which means that you no longer need to protect the animal's habitat. You just have to protect the animal, but heck with the habitat. Well, anyone who knows about ecology knows that that's not going to get you too far. They redefined harm. So you couldn't have an indirect harm from a thing like a climate change. It had to be direct, like that animal had to actually be deterred from reproducing or killed. It had to be more A equals B. And then there were protections for threatened species that had been in place for many years that helped them not become endangered. Those were cut back so that now you're going to end up with more species on the endangered list because you're not preventing the endangerment. They're already threatened. They also took out consideration of things, for example, that shifts in climate are going to affect species movements and diversity. These 3 maps are actually still on the federal website, and they show range changes in ground plants. So these are not necessarily threatened plants, but it's an example that as we have threatened and endangered species, as the climate changes, those animals are going to be moving and their habitats need to move with them. Well, that is not something the Endangered Species Act will take into account. They also, again, elevated, as they did in the first Trump administration, elevated the role of money. So money and economics has a much higher role to play in the balancing act. So that's in place now. It's rolling for better or worse. Here's one that's still not been finalized, and this is the redefining of the waters of the U.S. or WOTUS. How many people have heard of WOTUS before? It's kind of a big mouthful of an acronym. The waters of the US basically defines what the federal government will protect in the way of navigable rivers and streams and lakes, but also wetlands. And the big thing about that is the wetlands, because how you define a wetland, as you all know, living here in the Central Sands is really important, and wetlands play a role in recharging groundwater and all sorts of important habitats for wildlife, et cetera. So they've proposed some changes. One would remove seasonal streams and wetlands. So the ones that aren't there all year round will no longer receive federal protection. The wetlands that don't touch a navigable highway or navigable waterway will likely lose protection. And if you take that in Wisconsin, it would be about 4.5 million acres of wetlands that would lose protection under these federal changes. We're expecting to hear very soon whether this goes through or not. But not all gloom and doom. Luckily, Wisconsin has a very good wetland protection laws. So we're good here for now. However, we have to think about the regional and broader impacts. So if the prairie potholes get decimated, if wetlands in nearby states that migratory birds depend on get dug up and filled, those things will have cumulative impacts over the long haul. So we're watching this and we are concerned about it. Public lands, there has been some good news. We were really having a lot of, boy, did we have a lot of email coming in when the efficiency team was at work. It was just day after day, more and more things that were getting cut. And I'm sure you all knew people who were laid off or eliminated. The good news is Congress listened to all the uproar about those cuts and mostly have refunded public lands and many of those conservation agencies. However, there's still a lot of expertise that we've lost, a lot of institutional knowledge. So as an example, there's a U.S. Forest Service silvicultural lab in Rhineland that had 22 employees. They're now down to 14 because people left or got other jobs or retired. So even when the jobs are there, we have lost a lot of that institutional knowledge. And that's not to say there won't be more cuts in the future. So we have to keep an eye on this. Another thing that relates to public lands is some changes in the National Environmental Protection Act, or NEPA, which is another huge acronym and a giant process. I know, have you guys had any big NEPA projects here in central Wisconsin? For example, the Line 5 controversy up by the Chequamegon Bay that goes across with the big pipeline, that's got a NEPA process going on. When the forest, Chequamegon-Nicolet Forest does a new plan, it goes through a NEPA process. So one of the things that's happened with NEPA processes is there are proposals now to reduce the amount of depth and breadth of those processes. So they want to speed everything through. They want, for example, when a new project comes in, says we want to have a project, and they start the timeline for the research, they don't want to allow, so say the study takes 3 years, they don't want to allow any new data. Once you file, it's only old data is allowed, not new data. So if you learn something really important 6 months out, that will not be allowed into the environmental review. They don't want to allow indirect impacts, things like climate change. They don't want to allow revisions of the, once it comes out, not revisions. They don't want to force agency consultation, so the Army Corps wouldn't necessarily have to talk to the Fish and Wildlife Service. They can, but they don't have to. Shortens the timelines for public comment. That's really important for all of us. If we've got to wade through 500 pages of some gosh darn document and try and think what to say, that takes a long time. It also redefines the foreseeable future. So is the foreseeable future 200 years from now or 10 years from now? So there's things like that where they tweak these things and then it can have a difference on how those processes unfold. Another good one that they're working on is removing greenhouse regulation from the EPA, a proposal to remove greenhouse gases. There was a legal decision that the EPA could regulate greenhouse gases, that it is an important impact on all of us. And that is being pushed out. And the idea is to get rid of those climate policies that were based on that need to regulate greenhouse gases. And Nancy probably could correct me if I didn't quite say that right. Okay. And then just a couple other things that we're watching. The Congressional Review Act is this obscure act. How many people have heard of this one? It's actually been on the books since I think the 1960s, but rarely used. It's an opportunity where Congress or the administration can come in and take a look at a document and say, hey, we don't like this anymore. So they can use it to go in, say you have a plan for a federal Fish and Wildlife area or for a national forest. The Congressional Review Act can come in, they'll say, we want to look at that document, and they can make changes or decide they want to redo it. And they're using that right now on this issue up in the Boundary Waters to try and get that copper mine put in, because there was a plan that was created and then rules put in place so that you couldn't mine in the Boundary Waters area. And they're using the Congressional Review Act, which kind of shortcuts the process and shortcuts public input into those processes. So we could go on for longer, but I'm going to close up here and give time for conversation. Are we making a difference as Greenfire? Well, we're sure we feel like we're doing a lot. Whether we're making a difference right now, well, I hope so. I hope we are. And I think some of the Congress sneaking all that funding back into the Great Lakes fisheries and the various resource labs, the USGS resource lab in La Crosse. I mean, it shows that they're listening, that not everybody is just marching to a tune. And we're still continuing as Greenfire to work on all of our things that we were doing before. Things from data centers to wake boats. We've had people on the beaver management plan. We had people on the crane hunt proposals. We're still reviewing state property management plans, looking at PFAS and CWD and all sorts of things on a state level. We've also got some citizen science going on with a new program called Nitrate Watch, where you can go out and sample your local water for nitrates. And we're doing some toolboxes with Northern Lakeshore residents. And we have these federal issues on top. So we're certainly spinning our wheels along and trying to keep cranking stuff out. And one of the things that I believe we are going to do is, before the midterms, come out with a new paper that talks about the importance of science in democracy and how listening to science and using science in policy is important. And hopefully get people encouraged to go out and vote for candidates, no matter what party, who will utilize science and factual information in their decision-making. Here's how you can keep up to date with us at Greenfire. You go to our website. We have lots of stuff on there. If you can't find what you're looking for, put it in the search, because we have papers, we have blogs, we have webinars that are recorded. We have all of our work groups. You can click on them and contact people that are engaged in those groups and find out what's going on. And I would be remiss if I didn't say you could become a supporter of Greenfire. All this good work costs something, and we have been really lucky in our short lifetime to have had really good support from the people of Wisconsin. But we are still a very small nonprofit. We only have 3 full-time staffers, and we have 2 part-time, and we could use a couple more full-time people. So we could always use more funding to do our good work. You could consider, maybe you have expertise you'd like to volunteer and participate in one of our teams. We're also rethinking our work groups a little bit. We have these work groups. It sounds intimidating. Would you like to be part of a work group? Look at Nancy's laughing. So, we're thinking, well, maybe we need to have pools of people that will say, would you be in our pool of people? When an issue comes up, we could come to you and ask you to step in and help us for a couple weeks on project X or Y. And we think that may be more attractive than joining a work group. Now, there are people that like work groups, but my sister, from the very start, she's like, why are you calling those work groups? No one's going to join them. Anyway, so consider volunteering. It can be fun and rewarding. Share information and be an advocate. I'm sure you folks are all advocates, people who are in Audubon for science and sound policy. And with that, I'm going to just end. I've got a Kurt Miney quote here, but I had another quote I wanted to end with. So you can read Kurt, but I had a really 3 quotes about science. Oh, I got to stand here. I can't move. 3 quotes about science that I really like. When I was giving my Science on Tap and didn't have any slides, I had these 3 quotes. One is from Bill Nye, the science guy. He said, "Science is the best idea we ever had." I think that one's really good. I can even remember that one without reading it. Carl Sagan, gotta always quote Carl Sagan on science. "Science is a way of thinking much more than a body of knowledge." And I think that is something people don't get, that it's a way of thinking about things. And then here's kind of a blast from the distant past. Marie Curie, the historical figure Marie Curie. And this what kills me because it's so appropriate today. "Nothing in life is to be feared. It is only to be understood. Now is a time to understand more so we can fear less." And I don't know about all of you, but I have had fear more than a few times in the last couple years. And I like that idea. We need to understand more and fear less. So that's what I will close with and open up for your comments or question. I don't know if the online people can also have questions or how that's going to work here, but. So, anyone have a question or a comment? Yes, Eric.
Is it already like a federal organization that's similar to this? I thought there was like a federal employees and environment ethics or something like that.
Well, there's the Union for Concerned Scientists.
But there was like watchdog.
There are, so in federal agency, we've learned of this a little bit. There are retiree groups from different agencies that are doing things. We're not necessarily connected with them. It's interesting. Once someone retires, it's hard to find them. Like they lose all their contact info. One of our challenges is trying to connect with retirees, because I think right now we have a terrific opportunity to recruit federal employees into Wisconsin's Green Fire, which has had some federal employees, but has been predominantly state, kind of state folks. So there are groups that are doing work, but we're not tied with them directly. But we should be. We need more people to do. Would you like to lead that? No. Yes.
Ever in search of good news, wondering, can you on the drop of the hat here, come up with like a example of a action that you feel good about that's come from your organization?
So the question was looking for good news. Are there actions that we've done that we feel good about? Yes. I think we've had quite a few success stories. So, and maybe they haven't all come to the end result yet, but they're working in that direction. So a good example would be, I don't know how many people here were tracking all that wake boat kerfuffle that was going on at the state capitol where they threw the Sandhill Crane bill on. Well, our group has been very instrumental in building the coalition that's come up with a bipartisan bill on wake boats. Now, it didn't get introduced. They had it in the Senate and they were ready to introduce it, but they didn't introduce it. So it didn't go anywhere this year, but maybe next year. So we've built a coalition, a bipartisan coalition around wake boat regulation that will help protect our lakes. That's a good example.
Bipartisan facilitation going, like, I mean, that was a little bit of what you were talking about.
Well, I think,
How are you doing that?
how do we do? So I think it's, first of all, you have to build relationships with people. So how do you build a bipartisan relationship? And it's getting harder because we've got this huge division going on. But I think we all know that everybody wants clean water and clean air. And most people in Wisconsin, I think even in the legislature, believe that Wisconsin's outdoors is really important, whether it's to the economy or to the lifestyles. And I think what you have to do is build those relationships with people where you don't attack them and you look for common ground. And I think in Wisconsin, in the Midwest, we're good at doing that. We need to keep plugging away and not give up on that. And I think our executive director, Melissa, is really good at that. She's connected with a lot of people in Madison, so she's good at reaching across the aisle. And we have another fellow named Paul Heinen, who's our lobbyist, and he knows people. So that helps, I think, when you get to that kind of a level. I think on a local level, when we're talking about science, I think we have to be careful. Like if I was giving this talk to the general public, I would have been more circumspect, probably. I made some assumptions about this group, but talk about things that you all care about, ice fishing and being able to enjoy lakes, but you don't have to say you're going to the wilderness canoeing and you don't want any boats out there. I think we have to work on that. And then we have to look at the economic end of things because environmental conservation makes money. Pollution loses money. We want to look at long-term sustainability. We have to look for those areas we can all agree on and just keep plugging away at it. But it is exhausting sometimes. Yeah.
I have one. WPI reported that the Wisconsin Senate passed a bipartisan $133 million PFAS cleanup package on March 17th of 2022. So that just happened yesterday. And I know Melissa's
been tireless on that one. Yes, yes. And that is really good. And there's a good example, like everybody cares about drinking water. So it's important. Nancy.
I think a lot of what we do too, because we do public presentations like this and we're involved in so many networks of networks and whatnot, that it's hard to say like we affected this, right? But our conversations and our participation and the expectations of how we are behave, right? Like we can't go in, I can't say I'm Green Fire and then just state my personal opinion, right? I am representing Green Fire, and Green Fire has, I've heard over and over again, a really good reputation among all colors of legislators, right? The whole gambit and beyond, because they've been very mindful about being neutral. I can't tell you how many hours of meetings when we were first getting going, we talked about how to not do advocacy, how to provide information for advocacy groups, and they can do their thing.
So for those on the Zoom, Nancy is basically talking about the importance of science, advocacy in science. And part of it has to do with not using value-laden language. Like you just state the information without adding some kind of a leading word that makes it sound terrible or great or whatever. And so even in this most recent federal push, I think, I said Trump administration a couple times tonight because it is so obvious that science is being disrespected there. Isn't to say we wouldn't be really happy to work with them on science, but it is a fine line and we have to be careful about it. Yeah.
Example of what you have somebody on a working group be doing, would we be researching, would we be talking to politicians? No, what would you do?
So the question is, what do volunteers do for us? And we're actually working on that right now because it is a little vague. And because we started with like 100 people that were all working together that came together. So we had this big pool and, people after a few years, they're like, okay, I want to go do something different now. So we're in a new recruiting of, and we have a new name for our volunteers and expert collaborate. It's not, I can't remember what we call it. It's a new word and I cannot learn it. I've got to get it in my head. Anyway, but to answer your question, there are different levels of things that we could do. So we have regular volunteers that could help us staff a booth or set up for a workshop or, that kind of thing. We have volunteers who are on our communications committee who help us with editing or coming up with ideas on new communications tools. We also then have these more technical groups who might be, so for example, right now, we have a group that's working on telling science stories from people who did research for the USGS and the Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Units. And so they're contacting researchers and saying, would you tell us your story about the work that you do so we can explain why your science is important? Then we have other groups that are doing more technical things. For example, the wetlands group that's looking at the WOTUS rules. They're working in collaboration with other scientists to try and get a fix on how much the changes in that rule would impact Wisconsin wetlands and get maps and graphs. And then we'll probably put that into some kind of a publication. So sometimes there's an editing role that can be played, or sometimes it's writing a sidebar for part of a technical paper. If there's someone that has expertise on groundwater, we'll say, George Kraft, will you please write us 2 paragraphs on groundwater? Folks here know him, but he lives right down the road. So that kind of work. So there's sort of a variety. Yeah.
I think can you expand on how you work with career scientists? Because I have many colleagues that feel like our voices aren't being heard, like we don't have a way of putting input on that policy.
So, are you saying people who are working in the sciences?
Yeah, but like early.
Right. So what we've been doing, mostly we've been working with college students and grad students, and we're trying to design specific projects where they could get experience helping us write something or helping with a team that's working, pulling together the information for a product. So that's one way that's kind of easy. We've also been sponsoring once a year retreat up in Land O'Lakes where we have young professionals coming from all over the state, and then we bring in our folks and they have sessions and workshops and things like that. But I think for professionals who are in their careers right now and wanting to get more information out, we welcome those people to be in our work groups. Often they don't feel comfortable with it, but if there were things that they wanted to provide to us that they felt comfortable to provide informationally, things that they think would be useful for people to know or areas of research that needed to be looked at, we would welcome that. In fact, we'd love to have people from all ages in our teams, but oftentimes people who are in the thick of their careers don't have time, or they feel that they have sidebars on their employment. So they would have to feel comfortable they could do it in their off time. And we don't have to always have everybody's names on everything either, so. Can you add to that, Nancy?
It's hard to explain what our work groups do, but like, okay, so we have a topic we're working on, right? Whether it's a policy challenge or whatever, smaller topic. And so a subset of the work group is members will say, I'm interested in working on this, right? And some dig into technical aspects of it, but a lot of it is Zoom conversations talking about how should we address this and what should we include in our paper and how do we explain this so that lay people can understand and that kind of thing. And I can see like a lot of value in early professionals, mid-professionals weighing in on that, right? Because we're coming at it as like, I've been in this field for many decades, you know? And so I can bring my perspective, but it may be you would probably have a very valuable insight and perspective that would enhance the outcome of what's being done. So you don't necessarily have to be participating and digging into data or digging in deep into the policy to be a participant. Yeah, and you come and go as you want. So
Right.
life gets busy and you're like, it's interesting, but I don't have time. I finally learned how to do that. It's taken me 30 years.
Yeah, and you could even just maybe sit in on a couple work group meetings and then you get a feeling for whether it was something that would work for you or not. The other thing is we are recognizing, there's also, say you are a retiree and you've been in your field, you're doing X, Y, Z, and then you get out. There's a certain time period where you still have a lot of connections and expertise, but the further out you get, and there's more people coming up and new ideas and new things. I mean, there's a certain point where we need new people to come in and bring those new ideas because science changes all the time. So solving this funnel of bringing younger people into our group is really important for us. And we're grappling with it now. We'd love to hear ideas on how we could make it work too. We don't have it figured totally.
So we have these work groups and we're the same buckets basically that we and I are having. All the other agencies, we're all bucketed doing our thing and we're trying really, really hard to look at things more as a system. And I think that people that are less ingrained in operating in the buckets would be extremely fast.
Right. We're trying to get out of our silos or buckets. Yeah.
Cross silo conversation.
Right.
So that we're actually tackling conservation issues, because we
Right.
can't do it, we're unsuccessful in our little silos or buckets.